Hello, my name is Jurren and I'm your host today with this interview, and today we're interviewing a extremely interesting individual which I'll introduce to you right now. It's author and subconscious mind reconstructed researcher, Lord Chancellor of the exiled King of England, Greg Hallett from New Zealand, and today's date is the 22nd of October 2011. The purpose of this interview is to get to the truth, as this is a world of incredible lies and manipulation, deception and smoke and mirrors, and also to raise the consciousness of the people of this world to be aware and to realize what's going on in this world which is so evil around them. Most of this presented information will be totally unbelievable to certain people, but people should do their own due diligence and research rather than to take everything that's for granted from the mainstream media that comes through the television. Real knowledge is threatened. Just look at the murders that happened to all the people who got too close to it. People can only pull conclusions with the information they have been given. True knowledge is a choice. Truth crawls and lies have legs, so truth is slower than the lies. Truth is stranger than fiction. All that evil needs to triumph in this world is for good men to do nothing. With your research is Google, the search engine, your friend, and this long interview is dedicated to all people in the world in the peaceful quest of knowledge. Lord Craig is trained in different international psychological models, seeking redemption through exposure by having written 10 books, and all this new information comes from secret intelligence sources. None of the information from his books comes out of other books, but it's rather backed up by other books, autobiographies and reference works. His books are best described as historical crime-solving non-fiction. Lord Craig Hallett's books are the following: Hitler was a British agent, which is, according to certain chief historians in the world, the first adequate book in the world ever on Hitler. Second book, Gifting the United Nations to Stalin, Stalin British Training, Breeding Concubines and Pedophiles at War, How to Take Over the World, A Right World Con, New Zealand, A Blackmailer's Guide, The Sex Collectors, How the World is Run on Shame, which is written in 3 volumes, Volume 1, Stitch Ups, Volume 2, Murders, and Volume 3, Heroin Ticket. And also Are You My Father, The Family Court and Other Experiments. And his 10th and most recent written book, which will be available this Christmas 2011, that will rock the British and European monarchy, as Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of England, will soon find out, which is called The Hidden King of England. And most of the books he wrote together with his intelligence source called the Spy Master. And Lord Craig is not going to tell the people who that is, rather than it's a person who runs other spies, called the Spy Master. Lord Craig.
Well, wonderful introduction. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome to the show. First, I would like to commend you on all your work you've done, and I do find you a very brave individual, as you are exposing corruption, murders, massive pedophilia in this world, fake wars, fake monarchies, and also the massive drug trafficking in governments going around in this world. Can you confirm for the audience out there who is watching that you had 12 murder attempts on your life that all had to look like car accidents, or they had to do with attempts to poisoning you in the last 9 years, that you lost 9 houses, hundreds of thousands of dollars. They almost took your child off you. You lost all court cases in the last 18 years in New Zealand as you sued Prince Philip's agent, Peter Williams, QC. And QC stands for Queen Counsel. For murder, were beaten up by the New Zealand police, got blackmailed, all your books stolen and reference works in May 2005 by the Israeli Mossad, $10,000 of damage to your Mercedes car, which was attacked twice, were of course accused for murder by Prince Philip's agent, were surveyed for such a long time by MI6 and the Israeli Mossad by telephone taps, helicopter flyovers, were bugged, broken in, were denied a master's degree in history by Auckland's University after written 4 history books. And by the time that your books came out, they abolished in New Zealand the label that is supposed to put
the fiction, non-fiction,
to the fiction and non-fiction that's supposed to go on each book that comes out in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So, Lord,
just a few corrections there. There's 3 houses, and I had 3 Mercedes, and they're all attacked. And my last Mercedes was attacked 3 times, and it was blown up, but it was by internal implosion rather than explosion. It was implosion followed by a bill, implosion followed by another bill, and implosion that had a bill that was greater than the value of the car. Carry on with the introduction. Okay. I'm listening.
Yeah, we'll continue with the introduction here. It's amazing. Welcome to the show. And Lord Craig, can you tell us a little about your intelligence sources, which are called in your words the walking dictionaries and the living libraries, and that information goes round and round before you ever publish
round robin.
Yeah, before you publish anything, because people do ask me all the time, where's Greg Hallett getting his information from? You know. Please explain.
Okay. When I was working in Moscow for DHL in December '89, I noticed that the people in Moscow and in Russia were deconstructed. That is, that their subconscious minds had been changed to think like the state of Russia. So I developed a method of reconstructing the subconscious, which was to change the person's subconscious from thinking like the state or the church or whatever governing body to an individual. And I mentioned that on radio in New Zealand in January 2002. And then in June 2002, the president of the Scientist Club in St. Petersburg flew out to New Zealand and asked to see me. We met, and he ended up camping at my place for a month, and he briefed me on a whole lot of Cold War secrets, including gravity and anti-gravity. And he suggested to me that the way to understand gravity was to work out how to fly the planet. So he gave me some initial pointers, then I ended up writing a book. In between writing, Hitler was a British agent, called Flying the Planet. And at the end of his month-long stay, he said, "Would you like a reconstruction?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "What would you like to get reconstructed as?" And I said, interim Prime Minister and 2-term Governor General. So I was, and it took 10 hours from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. And then the next day I met the former 2IC of intelligence, who was having lunch with the mafia boss, which is actually typical in New Zealand. So I started to get briefed for the next 7 years, and I was briefed 4 to 6 times a week over an intense period of about 4.5 years, and it started to wind down a bit in about July 2009, and it was 4.5 years before the story started to repeat. So I was essentially a confessee to intelligence. So I was able to collect the stories on New Zealand and also stories that New Zealanders had played a part in overseas, and put them all into a book and several books. And that's how I got my knowledge. So I got it all from inside sources.
Right. Yeah, that's quite something.
It's an unusual way to go about it, but it's the unusual path that gets the results.
Can you elaborate a little bit more for the people who are wondering what is reconstruction of the subconscious, how it actually works and what it is? Because I'm sure a lot of people are not.
Okay. Well, you've got hypnotism, and it's not hypnotism. What it does is the process bypasses the conscious and unconscious minds, and there's about 3 or 4 different methods of doing it now. So you bypass the conscious and unconscious mind and talk directly to the subconscious. And the subconscious is a very powerful tool. Your subconscious is virtually the same size as the universe. Or it might be a better way to put it, you can Google the universe. So what tends to happen is that when you reconstruct the subconscious towards your goal, then everything in your life moves towards that goal, even when you're not consciously or unconsciously thinking about it. So it's really just like drawing in.
Works like magic.
And it's straight away, bang, it's straight away. Reconstruction and deconstruction of the subconscious used to take 9.5 months in Hitler's time, when he was deconstructed by the British. And when Admiral Dönitz was captured by the British and deconstructed, then he ended up becoming the head of the Navy and the Führer for a while. He was actually a British agent. So in 1912 and 1917 it took 9.5 months. In 2002 it took 10 hours. And now it's probably down to 3.5 hours. Yeah. Maybe 2.5, maybe 1.5.
As technology is so much more advanced.
There's technology, and there's also the shamanic way of doing it, which is when the person understands the theories, understands the application, and understands a multitude of responses, and can move that person rapidly right through it very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go to the last section of our introduction with Lord Craig Hallett.
What, there's more?
Well, of this introduction, yeah. To that, all of your history is like new history to a lot of people, and including to me. You said before that if you've studied history, you've been propagandized, and you've learned bunk.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the general propaganda machine, layers of lies, and the manipulation on top of the truth, which is called the 4 layers of history.
Well, can you give me a lead-in?
Yeah. The 4 layers of history. Like, if we take...
So you got the official history.
So the official history is the first layer.
Yeah. Well, you got what really happened.
Yeah.
And you got the official history, and you've got the intelligence history that's leaked, which is actually counterintelligence history, and then you've got what really happened and the motivations behind it. And to understand the real history, you've got to realise, for instance, who was Winston Churchill working for and who was Adolf Hitler working for.
Right.
And it turns out that Adolf Hitler was working for the British, and that Winston Churchill was working for, well, the royal family and the Illuminati, which, very much tied together. And Hitler was also working for the banks as well, and so was Churchill. World War II was a war that was designed to bankrupt the nations, which it did. So every country ended up owing money to the banks. There's nothing more expensive for a country than going to war, especially when the war is on their soil.
Yeah. And those are just holes in history which are not told through the mainstream media. When you watch National Geographic, they're not talking about those subjects.
No, they don't. If you look at
all
of the other history books on Hitler, none of them mention his period from 1912 to 1913.
Right.
Because he was in Britain.
Yeah.
He was in the Tavistock in London, and he was in Liverpool staying with his half-brother and sister-in-law.
So basically the conclusion is if you study the holes, you get to the truth.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, and
because they're just holes in history, and holes in history books the size of you can fly a Boeing 747 through.
Yeah, you can, and the rest of it is just propaganda.
Yeah, it is true. Yeah. So, going on in this interview with Lord Chancellor of the exiled King of England, Greg Hallett, we are going to talk about, number one, the histories between 1776 and 1915. Second subject is going to be the British monarchy and the hidden King of England. So, me having said that, we go to the first chapter right now. And the first chapter was the years of history from 1776 till 1915. And today's date is the 22nd of October 2011, and my name is Jurren, your host, and we're talking to Lord Chancellor of the exiled King of England, Greg Hallett. So, my first question, Greg. Independence for America, the United States of America, was declared on the 4th of July 1776, as we still celebrate every year today. As 1776, numerological wise, means new beginning of government. Was the whole American Revolution rigged and a con? And please explain to the audience. It's 1776. If you take the numbers, 1 plus 7 equals 8. And 8 means new beginning, because you can draw the number over and over again. And then 76, the last two numbers of the year is 1776. 7 plus 6 is 13, and 13 means government. So it's new beginning of government. Do you have any idea who started the revolution in that year? And why it was caused?
No.
Okay, next question. There's nobody.
No, well, I can have I can have a guess. 1st of May 1776 was the beginning of the Illuminati in the cave in Bavaria.
It's a very important Illuminati date, the 1st of May.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like Bin Laden discovered May 1st.
So that was Adam Weishaupt, who had collected a whole lot of occult symbolism and occult patterns from all around the world and combined them all together. And that was something that the Illuminati followed. And it appears that the American government has been occult driven. And it also appears that the American government and the whole of the United States is a British plantation. And that America actually pays its taxes to the monarch of Britain, who then redistribute it back to America. And the Queen can write letters, and I've seen these. She can write simple letters to the American government, dictating to them what the social policies and what the law will be in America. So America is a British plantation. It was raised up after World War II to succeed Britain, and then it was chopped off at the knees on the 11th of September 2001, and this was predicted in a British Israel document in 1937, saying that the end of America would be 5 days later on the 16th of September 2001.
17th
was it? 17th of September. So, they were 6 days out. So that was 1939. And that was 1937.
Yeah, this is called the British-Israeli Federation Movement. I think it's called. Yeah.
And 2 years later, America printed its new dollar notes that had pictures of the Twin Towers collapsing on the 5, 10, 20.
Yeah. The different stages of
the different stages of the collapse. Yeah. So the collapse of the American of the United States government as the peak civilization was only deemed to last from 1945 with the collapse in 2001. It's taken a while to collapse. And with Israel then superseding America as the prime civilization from about 1993, which is when President Bill Clinton Clinton handed over America's greatest technology to Israel, including HARP and the Nautilus projector. And President Bill Clinton turns out to be British. He was born in Britain in 1946, and he turns out to be the son of Pamela Digby Churchill and her father-in-law, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill was the illegitimate son of King Edward VII. So we've got an American president, Bill Clinton, who was the grandson of the British monarch, King Edward VII, which is not known in history. And both King Edward VII and Bill Clinton were given the same byline, the peacemaker. And they both created wars. So they were propaganda bylines. So we could talk for quite a while on the British monarchy's illegitimate children and how they have risen to power and run programs in other countries,
which will,
under different names.
Which will go in depth in the second chapter, but this is still chapter 1, which is the history from 1776 till 1915. So my second question to you is, in this period we also had Napoleon doing his work, I might say. Yeah. So the question is, was Napoleon's march to Moscow in Russia in 1812 and the loss of 600,000 of his people out of his army of 625,000 people, was it a cold hit? Was it on purpose? Was it on purpose done, as wars are fake wars, as you describe?
Well, Napoleon was given a chance. He was the great-grandnephew of Louis XIV. So Louis XIV had a twin brother. Louis XIV was the slightly fatter brother, so they chose him, and they hid and jailed the skinnier and older brother. And Napoleon is supposedly the great-grandson of that second brother. So they did give him a chance to rule. He was a bank-funded agent. The Rothschilds ran the banks, owned the banks, and the Rothschilds funded Napoleon. So Napoleon succeeded in killing 600,000 of his soldiers, plus more. He also succeeded in recording Egypt via pre-photographs, via etchings, and it's just the most beautiful collection of Egypt. It's just fantastic. Yeah. It's a book about that thick. So that was some great artistic work that he did there. When Napoleon was a Rothschild agent, Wellington was a Rothschild agent, and when Wellington and Napoleon went to war, it was the Rothschilds withdrew the funding of Napoleon and let Wellington win, and then that information was passed to them via Scanderoon pigeons. Scanderoon actually translates as Alexander the Great, and Scanderoon pigeons and homing pigeons have been some of the most influential things on war, the pigeon, the homing pigeon. So the information coming to the Rothschilds was that Wellington was winning, and they passed the information to everyone else that Napoleon was winning, and they used that to manipulate the stock market and then buy up when it was at its lowest. Yeah. That gave them the Bank of England.
Yeah, this is Nathan Mayer de Rothschilds.
22nd of June 1815.
Yeah.
Now, after that, the British royal family were also in debt to the Rothschilds. And then the Rothschilds took over the breeding rights of the British royal family. So Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who was the head of the Rothschilds dynasty in England, started to breed with the British royals, as did his son Lionel Nathan Rothschild. So that we find from about the time of Queen Victoria that the children were all fathered by the Rothschilds and are illegitimate, and what I'm going to show you is that they're also bigamously born.
Yeah.
Meaning that a lot of the royals are not royals at all.
Yeah. And it's true that the Bank of England was taken over by the Rothschilds in 1815, that same year that the...
22nd of June, yeah.
Yeah. That's amazing. So, that made him control Europe, of course, as Napoleon was controlling Europe before the battle, and then he got defeated. So that's the Rothschilds in charge. Can you elaborate a little bit about Napoleon's escape from Saint Helena, or Helena, and where he is buried today? Because that's not very known in modern history.
He officially died in 1821.
Yeah.
But he escaped in February 1820. And he had a seaman who looked similar to him. So he put out a round robin to find someone who looked like him. And they came up with a seaman called Eugene Lenormand. And Eugene Lenormand sailed to St. Helena and then rowed ashore into a cave and met Napoleon in a cave. And Napoleon got down the cave on a silk rope ladder, which was hidden in a tea chest, which was delivered to his house. So the silk ladder was incredibly strong and incredibly light. So they met, exchanged a few words in their clothing, and then Eugene Lenormand climbed up the silk ladder and became Napoleon on St. Helena. And Napoleon sailed back he was heading for Brest, and he ended up going to Antwerp and then making his way back to Paris. And he tried to claim that he was Napoleon, but there were all these people in mental asylums dressed up like Napoleon, claiming that they were Napoleon. So he decided that was not a good idea. So he became a watermelon salesman. And he's buried in St. Thomas Cemetery in Paris, right in view of the French Defense Department. So they've got like an 8-story building, and they look out the window and have their cups of tea and look down on the grave of Eugene Lenormand.
Which is Napoleon. And
and have a little, tea and chocolates and a little chuckle.
Right. And I assume that Eugene Lenormand is...
Well, they soon found out that Eugene Lenormand was a fake, so they poisoned him and killed him. And the British were quite happy because they didn't have to fund his stay on St. Helena anymore.
That's amazing.
So history is actually full of these really weird things. And when Eugene Lenormand died, they shipped his body to Paris, and they were they built a mausoleum for him, and it took about 20 years to build the mausoleum. And during that time, the British stole the body that they thought was Napoleon, and buried him in the Horse Guards, which is in between Scotland Yard and Buckingham Palace, right? And the Duke of Wellington used to visit the grave of what he thought was Napoleon and talk to it every day with his hand behind his back and it walked around. But it wasn't. It was Eugene Lenormand. Yeah.
Okay, next question. The murder on American President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Was it rigged? Was it a cold hit? And what else can you tell us about Abraham Lincoln?
Well, Abraham Lincoln was never Abraham Lincoln. His father was A.A. Springs, and his supposed father, Thomas Lincoln, never physically existed. And he had a wife called Mary, and he also had a bodyguard, and he used to sleep with his bodyguard. Right, so he was that way inclined. Now his wife Mary had a lot of slaves. They came from large slave-owning family. And 31 years before the American Civil War, which was, we were propagandized to think that it was to end slavery. But 31 years before, the combine harvester and the mechanical reaper had been invented. And that meant that slaves were now very expensive to keep. So they were trying to get rid of the slaves, so they decided to have an American Civil War to free the slaves, and then sent the slaves into war and killed off the slaves, and then took their cotton via mechanical reaper and combine harvester. And at the same time, in 1861, when the American Civil War began, there were 7,000 different currency notes in America. And every village had a printing press and was printing their own notes. So the Rothschilds, who owned the central bank, wanted to get it just down to the 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 50, $100 note, and some ornates, which went up to $20,000, maybe $30,000. So they decided to have a civil war and put both sides, North America and the northern states and the southern states, in debt to both banks, bring in the single greenback notes, and virtually bankrupt the North and the South, kill off a whole lot of slaves, and call that the end of slavery. So it was a rig. And then my understanding is that the assassination of Lincoln was faked, because all we've got is a couple of etchings. Someone who was caught for it, who may or may not have done it, they were probably in on it, and then set free. And you can tell that Abraham Lincoln was a British agent, because when you go to bank in London, in the Royal Exchange building, there's a statue of Abraham Lincoln, a bust there, and someone's actually put a bullet hole in the statue. It's just like right there, you know. And next to him is I think it's John Paul Reuters. So you can see Lincoln here. There's the doors entering to the Exchange building behind you. There's Lincoln here, and there's John Paul Reuters there, who was the propagandist from Reuters. So they're all working in together. And there's just so much of history now that we can't trust. And I don't trust that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at all, especially since his father, Thomas Lincoln, never existed. His real father was A.A. Springs, who was a huge financier.
Yeah.
And they had an enormous amount to gain by putting in a son under a different name, you know, which still happens to this day, like Winston Churchill and Pamela Harriman, his concubine essentially, and his daughter-in-law, put in their son, Prince William Churchill Rex, you know, grandson of the King of England, into the American presidency.
Yeah.
No one knew. And so what they did is they came up with a cover. They had 6 fathers, and one of them fell out of his car and drowned in a puddle. Yeah, love it, you know, it's really believable, yeah. And his mother never actually looked like him at all. And even when the true story comes out that Bill Clinton is the son of Winston Churchill, they're still pumping the idea that he had 6 different fathers and one of them died in a puddle, and he's got a mother that doesn't look at all like him. And he's got a brother that doesn't look anything like him at all. His brother is similar in that he's white and that he's within 6 inches in height. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's the connection. There's no intelligence connection, there's no charisma connection. It's just a joke, but they keep it out of the media, and they keep fronting almost the clutch cargo talking lips of Bill Clinton as being, you know, the truth, and they pump him up as a charismatic. And when people get close to the truth, they bring up the Monica Lewinsky story as another distraction. But the Monica Lewinsky story was really, she was a Polish Mossad agent, and she was there to run a distraction, to put pressure on Bill Clinton so that he would surrender the best weapons America had to Israel.
Right. And he was protected, Bill Clinton, by Queen Elizabeth II, wasn't he?
Yeah, she called up a favour because Bill Clinton is the half-brother of Queen Elizabeth II. Because Queen Elizabeth is also the biological daughter of Winston Churchill by artificial insemination. And it was one of the first cases of artificial insemination. And it's the same for Princess Margaret. And the Irish knew about it. But, there's no media in Ireland. It just doesn't get into the mainstream media.
Yeah.
It's sidelined because they know.
That's amazing. Yeah. Anyway, talking about more holes in history, we're going to talk about my personal favorite history aspect, what happened, which is the sinking of the passenger ship, the Titanic, which happened on the 15th of April 1912. And the ship hit the supposedly iceberg on the 14th of April 1912. So when I sum up all these similarities and coincidences about it, and most likely the reasons why the ship had to go down and who died on it, you wonder what really happened. So I'll give the sum up right now and then we'll ask for your comments. So we're talking about the passenger ship, the Titanic, which hit the iceberg on the 14th of April 1912. It was the biggest ship in the world that was ever built at that time, called unsinkable under lots of propaganda through the media. It was the ship's first maiden voyage and the captain's last maiden voyage, as he was going to retire 2 or 3 days later in New York. And New York was the destination for the ships. And at Strip, the next year, the Federal Reserve partial owner and Titanic funder, J.P. Morgan, cancelled his trip with the Titanic. He was supposed to go on the ship and travel along to New York, but he cancelled his trip just a few days before the ship had to sail. A book called, which I'll show right now here to the audience, called The Unsinkable, let me see, what is it? The Sinking of the Titan, written by author Morgan Robertson. This book came out in 1898, which is 11 years before the ship was ever built. And this book has all the Titanic aspects written in it, 11 years before the ship was ever built. So, coincidence or not, it looks like the whole event was orchestrated according to this book, and it's still available today at Amazon, where I bought it myself. But there's more. The Titanic was heading towards New York, called the Empire State. When the ship was launched on the 31st of May 1911, a person called James Dobbins lost his leg and died the next day. This was seen as a very bad omen for the ship. The Titanic also missed ramming another ship while leaving port, the port of Southampton on the April 10th, 1912, by a few meters, and one of the coal bunkers got on fire for the entire trip until the ship sunk. Sailing full speed through a ice field with not enough lifeboats by half in a dark, moonless night, with missing binoculars and too small of a rudder, as they found out with the sea trials they did, that the ship had a very slow reaction to its steering capacities. The lookouts in the crow's nest looking for icebergs that fatal night were in the open with no windshield, so their eyesight was impaired with the ice in their eyes. With the known -2 degrees Celsius seawater temperature, they know that people, I think it's 2 minutes, you go in hypothermia, but might be 5 minutes.
It'll be two.
Yeah, you'll be. It was real cold. Putting the engines in reverse when the iceberg was seen is not a smart action to do, because it took the pressure off the rudder while trying to avoid and steer away from the iceberg. As it sunk in 1912, it's exactly 100 years before the allegedly end of Mayan calendar, which ends in 2012. The first few lifeboats were lowered with half or less than half their capacity, and another passenger ship, the Californian, was only 10 miles away from the Titanic when it was sinking. Could have saved everyone, but the captain of the ship ignored the spotted and seen white color emergency flares because they were not in red color seen. And going on with the designing of the Titanic, the 15 watertight bulkheads that make the 16 watertight compartments, due to budget costs, they were only raised from the keel to E-deck. So they knew that if the first 5 compartments would be breached, the ship was doomed and the pumps couldn't save the ship. So this was done by budget costs, allegedly. The Titanic was given the wrong color emergency flares, white instead of red. Abraham Lincoln, we just discussed him, being a British agent, as you said, and also written in your books, I think it is, was shot on April 14th, 1865, as a British agent, in the head, and died the next day, April 15th, 1865. And the Titanic was a British ship, as it was registered in Liverpool, struck the iceberg on her bow, which is her head, basically, on the 14th of April 1912, and sunk and hit the bottom the next day, which is April 15th, 1912. All opposition to the Federal Reserve System in America were eliminated with the sinking of the Titanic. And their names were Benjamin Guggenheim, Isa Strauss, and John Jacob Astor. And those people were one of the richest people in the world at that time. This way, the Federal Reserve Act was pushed through US Congress a year later, which made the USA a debtor nation, which is a nation in debt by its how do you say this? By its
financial constitution.
Yeah. And 8 months after this act was signed by American President Woodrow Wilson, the Jesuits had sufficient funding through the Federal Reserve Bank to begin World War I for us. The Jesuit order is controlled by the Rothschilds, Morgans and Rockefellers, who now own the Federal Reserve. So, knowing all that, it's not inconceivable that we've heard so much about the famous voyage of the Titanic, because it was one of the most perfect crimes ever committed, I would suspect. And as Hitler later on said, the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. I would ask you, how was it made sure that she would go down the Titanic? Because it's not coincidence what we're talking about here now.
So, we're going to get an overview. Was it 51 years between the shooting of Abraham Lincoln and the sinking of the Titanic?
1865 to 1912. So that's, was it 35 plus 12 is...
47.
47 years.
Okay. Well, both are to do with the huge financial changes in America. One was bringing in the greenbacks and ending slavery because that was expensive. And the other was bringing in the Federal Reserve, which created slavery for both whites and blacks. African Americans from 1961, according to history. So, what was the question?
The question was, knowing that disaster events are they're not engineered to happen, they're allowed to happen, or a combination of both.
No, they're actually engineered. They're pre-engineered with the design of the ship and the budget cuts during the building of the Titanic, if it was the Titanic and not the Olympus.
Yeah.
But they're also built according to the novel, right? And the novel that's written might actually have been commissioned as well, because the powers that be like to have the out, I told you so, or we told you so. And they certainly outlined that the Titanic could sink. My personal view is that it was sunk by a can-opener submarine, which were available from about 1870.
Can openers.
Can-opener submarine, like,
Right.
how do you describe it? You know, a bit comes out of the side of the submarine and it runs along the side of the ship and chews through the walls of the ship and fills up the holes with water and then tilts the ship and sinks it.
Yeah, and for the people who find that hard to believe, as the ship was sailing, the ship was stopped allegedly when the iceberg was when it was struck by the iceberg.
Yeah, they used a can-opener submarine on a ship at the top of the South Island on the 16th of February 1986, and it was actually engineered with the complete complicity of the New Zealand government and the New Zealand Navy as well.
All right.
So can-opener submarine there, and they changed the SOS just beforehand to a CQD signal, which no one really appreciated, so that when the SOS was given out, it wasn't acknowledged. They changed the warning flares from red to white, and people were shooting out white flares to celebrate. So it was completely missed.
Yeah.
And what we were given in history was that some old woman lost a ring and it was found on the bottom of the ocean, and her love was for a lower class man, and so people played violins when the ship sunk, and that's what we were given.
Yeah.
Could it's a joke history.
Could it be, you think, that mind control
I
was
think
behind
some
all
of
this?
the crew were mind controlled, and I think the captain was in on it.
The captain died. The first officer who was on watch, he committed suicide that same night.
Yeah, but so we're told.
Yeah.
So we're told, and no one saw the iceberg. So, you know, what's the truth? What's the truth?
Yeah.
You know?
It is.
You can disregard so much of the eyewitness reports.
Yeah. And you got all the symbolism and coincidences all lined up.
Well, sinking ships is a complete art form, and it's done again and again and again. And if you consider that it was the British who sank the ship that Lord Kitchener was on the 5th of June 1916 at 8 p.m. And it was self-sabotage. They wanted to kill him, but at the same time they killed another 680 men. But they just wanted to kill Kitchener, you know. And the sabotage of ships is done repeatedly, and it's often self-sabotage. So it's often done either as an insurance job or with the complicity of governments.
Yeah.
Like, it was Winston Churchill who was behind the sinking of the Lusitania to bring America into World War One.
Yes, Lord Craig. I was going to ask you that in World War One, the question is: was the sinking of the passenger ship, the Lusitania, on the 7th of May, 1915, off the coast of South Ireland, was that an inside job as well?
It was completely organised by Winston Churchill. He was the Sea Lord. The Lusitania was loaded with gun cotton on the hulls. So if it got hit by a torpedo, the whole ship was going to explode. So it left Cunard Pier in New York on the 1st of May 1915 and motored towards Ireland. Now the British sent a cipher to their own agents in Queenstown in Southern Ireland, saying that they wanted the escort for the Lusitania removed. So that went, and it was in a cipher that the Germans could understand, so they knew that the escort was not going to be there. And then the Germans torpedoed the Lusitania, had gun cotton on the sides, and it was doing 15 to 18 knots. So instead of taking 1 to 2 hours to sink, it ploughed down in 18 minutes, loss of about 1,200 people. And that was used to bring America into World War One.
Right. It's amazing.
Yeah,
so it's
absolute sabotage.
So with all those examples, it's safe to say that history is a con, it's a lie, it's manipulated. With all those being inside jobs and rigged history examples, do we have any real history or non-rigged events that were not manipulated?
Well,
Like, how far do we have to go back in time?
probably to when I put my glasses back on to maintain continuity.
Right.
Oh, here we are. Are we in rigged history now or unrigged history? Pre-Archon.
Pre-Archon.
Yeah.
That's like 2,000 years?
Maybe more.
Maybe more.
Maybe, from before Alexander the Great. History has been rigged as long as history has been written.
Right. That's amazing. With massive holes.
Absolutely massive holes.
Right.
Yeah.
And this includes History Channel, National Geographic Channel, Discovery Channel. They don't tell you
Even
that Hitler was in England.
Yep.
Right. And all
Yeah,
that.
they all skipped that Hitler was in England. And if it is produced that Hitler was in England, then it's produced as a conspiracy and then written off with distractions. Yes, and Hitler had nephews and they're in New York and they all have changed their names and it's all very confusing and it's very badly produced. And what they tend to do is show documents, but they show them instant and then blurred, so you can't get any valuable information out of it.
Right.
So you've really got to get into the detail. The devil's in the details.
Yeah. With the Titanic being sunk by a can opener submarine, are there any more examples of other ships that were sunk by a can opener submarine?
There's a recent example in New Zealand on the 16th of February 1986 with the sinking of the Mikhail Lermontov. It was taken out of Picton Harbour on the top of the South Island by the pilot for Picton, who was called Don Jamison. And normally they go right around the South Island and they're heading down the west coast. And in this case, he cut in between two rocks at Port Jackson, between the lighthouse and another rock, Pelham Rock. He was close to the right-hand side of the rocks, which meant that if he hit a rock, it was going to cut on the right-hand side of the ship. Instead, a can opener submarine cut a 13-metre long hole, 5.5 metres below sea level on the left-hand side of the ship. And the ship came round, and it was still motoring, and it went into a shallow bay about 100 metres offshore so that people could actually get into the lifeboats and row to shore, and the lifeboats could come back and they could unload people. It got in close to shore, and then it turned around. This is with the breach of the hull. It turned around and motored into deeper water. They sent a mayday out at about 6:07 p.m, about half an hour after it got breached. No one received that mayday call. No one officially received it. The ship was calculated and due to sink at 9:30 p.m. The rescue boats arrived 10 minutes later, so it was due to sink at 9:20. The rescue boats arrived at 9:30, and the ship ended up sinking at 9:27 p.m. Now, it was supposed to sink with a lot of lives lost, and that didn't happen. What did happen was one Russian sailor was reported dead. When the ship sank, it was giving off a sonar beep at midnight every night, and that was actually mapping out the floor of the Cook Strait for the trawler wars. As well, 52 KGB agents got off that ship and infiltrated into New Zealand. And at the same time, same year, we had goods and services tax brought into New Zealand. The homosexual law reform bill was passed, and the Pope came to visit. Now, Richard Prebble intoned that Helen Clark and Margaret Wilson were responsible, and they were both KGB agents. Margaret Wilson sent out a press release from St. Petersburg in 1987 saying that people needed more face-to-face time with the Russians, and that was during the Cold War. She was a KGB prostitute, and Helen Clark was a KGB gangbang prostitute, and she turned out to be a pedophile as well, in the style of Janet Reno. And she was in a cover marriage to a homosexual child sex abuser called Peter Davis. And Helen Clark and Margaret Wilson, who were major players and instigators in the sinking of the Lermontov, then became lawmakers in New Zealand. Helen Clark became Prime Minister, and Margaret Wilson became Attorney General and Speaker of the House of Parliament. And Helen Clark went on to become the third in charge of the United Nations, specifically in charge of developing nations, which, as we know, is genocide through vaccinations and bloods with AIDS in it, etc.
And that's where she's positioned right now.
That's where she is right now, yeah. And the minister who brought in the goods and services tax that same year in 1986 is Roger Douglas, and in 1999 he was convicted of pedophilia by his stepson, and then that information was suppressed. So there's a major theme in history where sexual deviants, people who are not heterosexual and people who are shamed by their sexual practices, are the ones who are making history to our detriment and influencing history to our detriment. Almost as though they are commissioned to sink ships and sink the ships of nations in order to maintain cover for their sexual practices. And once they've done their double jeopardy deeds, they're promoted further and further and given everlasting cover, which includes a fake history written about them. So if you look at who gains, Helen Clark and Margaret Wilson became Prime Minister, third in charge of the United Nations, Attorney General and Speaker of the House of Parliament. And in the same situation, we should look at the Titanic and see who gains. And the person who gained was JP Morgan. He lost the Titanic, got the insurance money, and then got the Federal Reserve.
Which was pushed through next year, the Federal Reserve Act.
1913.
Which paved the way to the financing of World War I.
Yeah. So in New Zealand, with the sinking of the Macau Lermontov, or the misnamed Lermontov, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve got the goods and services tax, which is a tax of 10% on every exchange of money. That then went up to 12.5%, and more recently it's gone up to 15%. And what it does is cripple the poor. It doesn't affect the rich at all.
Right. It's always very important to ask the question, who benefits, isn't it? The
Cui bono?
Cui bono is Latin for who benefits. I think it was, I might be wrong here, but it used to be a law, I think, in Old Greek. Cui bono, who benefits? But we still can ask the same question today.
We should look at it in terms of war as well. Yeah. And we'll get on to Hitler and how he benefited and how the British benefited from having an Austrian run Germany and run Germany into the ground.
Yeah.
For the next chapter.